It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Reynolds, who's our speaker, and he's representing and his co-authors Spencer Lucas and Julia Johnson. But Steve, I've known Steve for a long time, since when he was a PhD student, I was a master's at the U of A in geosciences, and he's really been a role model for me all along. And he went to work for the survey in like 81, maybe? He did? Yeah. And spent 10 years at the Arizona Geological Survey. He was there. He was, when I started working there in 1988, Steve was there. And he made staff meetings really interesting. I was so sad when Steve decided to leave for greener pastures at ASU. But obviously that worked out really well for him as well. He's done a great job teaching. He's gotten high honors at ASU. I want to make sure I get this right. It's President's Professor at ASU, the highest honor that they give for teaching and research. So, but he's made tremendous, and he's retired a couple of years ago. But now he can do whatever the heck he wants to. So that's good. But Steve, it really throughout this time has made tremendous contributions to understanding Arizona geology. And back in the 80s, he was co-editor, lead editor really of the geologic. Tectonic evolution of Arizona? Yeah, sorry, I've got a paper and I can't remember it. But that was really, it's like 34, a long time, it's 1989. It's still a tremendous reference on Arizona geology of all kinds. It's really an awesome thing. And then kind of at the same time as he was doing that, he developed the first 1-to-million scale geologic map of Arizona that incorporated lots of new dating that had been done after 1969. And it's basically the same. There's been a new version in 2000, but it's basically the map that Steve developed in 1988 is still the primary geologic map for Arizona. So I could go on, but it's my pleasure to welcome Steve up here to talk about understanding the stratigraphy of the Supai and Naco groups on Mogollon Escarpment in that beautiful scenic area. Thanks, Steve.
Well, I was going to say there are a lot of old friends here, but I should phrase it as there are a lot of friends I've known for a long time. But it was really nice to see some of the Arizona. I worked at the Arizona Survey for 10 years, most wonderful job. And then I got hired away as a target of opportunity by ASU. Stan Keith once said, they just stole Arizona geology. And I taught at ASU for 32 years, had a wonderful career there. One of my former students, Chad, is here. And Chad just resubmitted a paper we wrote about the Moenkopi of the Southwest. So look for that at some point. But it was really nice to see people from the Arizona Survey, Tom McGarvin, who I haven't seen in forever, Stan Keith, and of course Phil Perthree and Mike Conway. So a really good turnout. I actually brought my brother back in John Reynolds. A lot of you know him. He's a geophysicist, older but not wiser. Yeah, and we have a sister that's oldest and not wisest, but yeah. So when I was at the Arizona Survey, Wes Peirce took me around. Wes, I would say, mentored me at the Arizona Survey more than anybody did. And he took me around, and we did this 4 or 5 day field trip, and we were looking at Pennsylvanian and Permian things. And I didn't, sometimes you're clueless. It's like when you're 20, you think you've got it all figured out. And you say, I've got it all figured out. And by the time you're 25, you say, I was so stupid when I was 20, but now I've got it all figured out. And that goes on the whole rest of your life. Wes Peirce took me on this field trip, and this talk was primed by that field trip, because Wes was trying to understand what the Pennsylvanian and Permian stratigraphy was. And in hindsight, he took me to all the important places. I've been working with Spencer Lucas, who's I would say the most productive geoscientist in the world. He probably has written 4,000 articles. I don't know if that's the number, I just made that up. But it seems like every week he sends me a reprint about something else. And then I worked with Julia Johnson, who was also a faculty member. Chad was a student of Julia's as well. And so we've been working, us three, plus a team of paleontologists and sandstone petrographers, all kinds of people have been working on this project. The stratigraphy of the Supai, frankly, has been a mess. You had a series of projects that were done, like master's theses and PhDs, and everybody kind of came up with their own names, and then you had other people, like Ron Blakey from NAU's done a lot of really important work on it, and he came up with some new names, and Wes Peirce had some preferences of what he wanted. And one of the interesting things that happened is when I was the geologic editor of the Geologic Evolution of Arizona book, Judy was kind of the grammar editor more. I invited Ron to write a paper on the Pennsylvanian and Permian of Arizona. And so Ron wrote that with a former PhD student from Arizona. And I had Wes review it. And Wes was so disagreeable with that paper that Wes said, I just can't stand this paper. And I says, Wes, write your own. And he did, and that ended up being one of the most important papers anybody's ever written about the Pennsylvanian and Permian of Arizona. So if you've ever wondered why that book has 2 articles on the Proterozoic, that's why. I was thinking of the other place that happened. 2 articles on the Pennsylvanian-Permian, that's why. The reason we have 2 different articles on the Proterozoic is Ed DeWitt and Phil Anderson couldn't get along. So I tried to have them write it together, and that blew up as well. So, you know, sometimes I'm a bad choice. Not advancing? Should? Still not advancing. Oh, there you go. So what do I mean by the Mogollon Escarpment? Mogollon Escarpment is another Wes Peirce term. We all know about the Mogollon Rim. That's this thing up here. You okay if I just point up here and walk in front of the screen? Okay. There's the Mogollon Rim. The Mogollon Escarpment is this big cliff in front of it, the cliff and slopes. And so we've been working on the Mogollon Escarpment from this place. This is over kind of by Sycamore Canyon from the Perkinsville Road. If you've never driven the Perkinsville Road, it's a really cool road. And then from here, basically all the way to the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. Think of White River, places like that. Okay, there you go. So most of you are Southern Arizonans. Well, I haven't seen you in a long time, Wolf. Most of you are Southern Arizonans, so I wanted to kind of introduce the stratigraphy in a way that wasn't assuming that you knew too much about things. So by the Supai, we're talking about this section of rocks that goes from the top of the red wall limestone to the bottom of the Hermit. When Darton first proposed the name Supai, he included all the red rocks in it. And so this unit here was also included in the Supai. Levi Noble did map the Shinnemoo quadrangle in the Grand Canyon, and he broke out that other unit as the Hermit. Turns out that caused us a bunch of grief. It would have been way better if the Hermit had stayed as part of the Supai, because people then think, well, is this really Supai? It depends on where you put the Hermit. So anyway, so this is the stuff we're talking about, both of these rocks actually. And so the Coconino is on top and the red wall's on bottom. Notice this is a very sharp contact of the Coconino and the Grand Canyon sitting on top of the Hermit. So those same rocks are in the Mogollon Rim, and traditionally these red rocks have all been called Supai. Here's the Coconino. It's very thick in here, and then sitting on top are Toroweep and Kaibab and basalt flows. And then as you go farther east, you don't have you have big cliffs and slopes, but it's all covered with stuff, manzanita and pine trees and rubble from the Coconino quartzite, you know, so it's a lot harder, but there's Supai along that whole escarpment all the way to, basically all the way to where it goes under the volcanics before you get to New Mexico. Sitting below the Supai is a unit that's been called the Naco Formation. Now, the Naco is a Southern Arizona group of units. It was named for Naco, Arizona. and it included everything from the Pennsylvanian all the way to the top of the Permian. These are just Pennsylvanian rocks mostly in the Mogollon Rim. But so people didn't want to call it the Naco Group, they called it the Naco Formation. And we'll talk about whether that's appropriate or not. So let's start at the bottom. In spite of what the red wall looks like in the Grand Canyon, this is what the red wall looks like in the Tonto Creek area, Mogollon Rim, Payson, Coles Ranch, that whole country. After the seas deposited the red wall, which was an equatorial sea, we were at the equator then, so you know the red wall's got corals and all kinds of stuff that you'd expect to see in the equator. After the sea pulled out, then you had a major weathering event. You're in a tropical environment, and so you made a karst topography, and so you basically dissolved the red wall. And so this is kind of what the upper 10 or 20 meters of the red wall looks like. It's nearly totally disaggregated. You get down a little deeper, it's got, yeah, maybe there's some layers still preserved in there. But so that's what the red wall, the Mississippian red wall underneath the Naco looks like. And then this is a great road cut. And so here's the red wall, and this is the Naco being deposited in there. It's being deposited, let's see if this pointer actually works. Yeah, I guess so. I like this better. Go away, pointer. Thank you. This is a karst pit. This is a karst pit, and this is a karst pillar, and another karst pit. And so, the first thing you see in the Naco, the basal units, is basically disaggregated red wall, and so it's chert breccias and things like that are laying on the surface. And then locally, that contact's really hard to see because you've got a disaggregated chert breccia with a marine shale sitting on top of it in a lot of places. And that's not a contact that's going to be well exposed. But we've been measuring sections all over the Mogollon Rim, and this is by Sycamore Canyon, and here's the disaggregated chert breccia, and here's a basal conglomerate of the Naco sitting on top. So locally, you see some actual bedded rocks in the basal part of the Naco. And then this is another road cut, kind of along the highway between Strawberry and Payson. And this is what the lowest bedded member of the Naco looks like. It's just full of chert class conglomerates and some sandstones and things like that. And so Doug Brew, who did a big detail, he did a PhD on the Naco. Phil, did you know Doug Brew? Yeah, he was around UVA for a while, and really nice job he did. But he named 3 members in the Naco, the alpha, beta, and gamma as you go up. And so this is his alpha member. And then this is the road cut by Christopher Creek, the turnoff between the Pace and the Heber Highway. And so now what you can see is nicely bedded limestones. It makes a big cliff. It's got coquina and other kinds of weird carbonate things in it. Carbonate things, that's precise language. And then this is what the upper Naco looks like. You still have limestones and stuff in here, but you start getting red clastics and you get a bunch of conglomerates as well. And so that's the gamma member. So alpha, beta's the carbonate. Alpha's the residual from the red wall. Beta is the limestone cliffs, and gamma member is the upper, basically a transition into the Supai. Okay, I'm afraid I have to teach you a little bit about the geologic time scale because I'm sure you've never worried about this part of it. And so the Pennsylvanian is broken into 5 different parts: Moravian, Atokan, Devonian, Missourian, Virgilian. And then the Permian, we're only dealing with 2 parts of it, the lowest of which is the Wolfcamp and the upper which is the Leonard. So I will throw these names at you at times. But the way to think of this is these 2 are lower Pennsylvanian, Des Moines is middle, and then these 2 are upper. So this is from Doug Brew's work. And so he's got alpha, beta, gamma over there on the far left side. And then he has all these fossils. I'm not going to make you read all this stuff. But the point is, nearly all of the Naco is middle and upper Pennsylvanian. You know, as far as Morowan, does he even have it on this diagram? No, it'd be down here. And, you know, maybe there's some of these that get down in it, but it's really, the Naco is really a middle and upper Pennsylvanian unit. Okay, so that's as much kind of stratigraphic time as we needed for right there. In the Grand Canyon, there are Ed McKee, who was at the U of A for some amount of time. He was the director of the Museum of Northern Arizona. I think he was USGS, but at a while he was at the U of A. And he said, well, the Supai shouldn't be a formation. It should be, Darton named it the Supai Formation. He said it should be a group. And they broke out names in it. And this is going to be good for you. There's 4 formations in it. Manicachaw, Wattahomagie, Manicachaw, Wescogamy, and Esplanade. And Wes Peirce is the one that taught me how to learn it, because he couldn't remember those names like I just didn't normally do. And his daughter said, just use an acronym. What a man Wes is. I use that to this day. So yeah, Wattahomagie, yeah, as I was trying to guess these, Karen, I was running through the what a man Wes is. So anyway, so there are these 4 formations.
Their families are from the Supai tribe.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, in the Supai of Oak Creek Canyon, Sedona area, there are 3 units that people talk about. And McKee, who studied the Grand Canyon, I mean, he published this big professional paper on the Supai that's just amazing what's in it. You know, they did clay mineralogy, they did sandstone petrology, they did fossils, they did the whole thing. We would like to do something that looks like what he wrote with the detail we're doing. And so in the Sedona area, he said there's A, B, and C. And sometimes they had used that terminology in other places, but A, B, and C. So A is the upper cliff formers, B is this middle slope unit, and C is a series of lower cliffs that are very calcareous sandstones. When you walk up to them, they look like limestones. And then as you track along the Mogollon Rim, this is a picture taken from Tonneau Creek, which is by Cole's Ranch. And here you can see there's a middle limestone unit. And people have used the middle limestone unit to subdivide this part of the Supai. And so people like Winters said there's something called the corduroy sandstone. This is not a test after this. Corduroy sandstone, Fort Apache, and the Amos Wash Formation. And so there's a series of units, and the question is, how do these match to what you see in the Grand Canyon? The Fort Apache limestone is pretty thick over on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, like along the road between Globe and Show Low. But by the time you get to Tonneau, it was what it is. Here's what it's looking like in Sedona. And then by the time you get to Sycamore Creek to the east, it's gone. So the Fort Apache is clearly, and the fossils kind of verify this, the Fort Apache is essentially a unit coming out of the Pedregosa Basin and coming up onto what people call the Mogollon Shelf. We're going to use that term, Mogollon Shelf. You know, it basically, you're not in the basin, but you're still able to be flooded by the seas. And so the Fort Apache unit in Sedona is being dominated by seas coming from the Pedregosa Basin. And then the other thing that you see in here, and Ron Blake was one of the first people to really emphasize this, is here's the Supai and here's the Coconino, and you can see that's just a complete transition between the two of them. You've got a Supai rocks here, you've got the first Coconino sandstone coming in, think sand dunes blowing in, and then those got eroded and beveled, and then you went back to Supai time, and then there's another sandstone and another, and then eventually the sand dunes overwhelmed the whole scene. And so you get the Coconino. And so, unlike the Grand Canyon, which has this sharp contact between the Coconino sitting on there, the Hermit, the contact between the Coconino and the red beds is completely gradational. And so Ron pointed this out, that there are rocks in Sedona that are not represented in the Grand Canyon, because this transition is not represented in the Grand Canyon. Wes completely agreed with this. Okay, so what we've been doing is we've encouraged some of the best scientists that we can find to come on this project with us. We've gotten the world's best expert, one of the world's 2 or 3 best experts on late Paleozoic fossil plants. We've got an expert on fossil pollen. We've got conodonts we're getting. And so we can go in here and say, oh, that's not just Leonard, that's Middle Leonard. We can go in and say, oh, that's late Leonard. And so we're trying to put a really tight constraint to these units because we want to try to correlate units from place to place with all these different names that have been produced. So let's see. So this is an article out of the Big Red Book, Digest 17. I just call it that, I always have. And so it shows some of the units that have been used. Here's some of the southeast units. You know, Horkia, you guys are familiar with some of these. And then here's this. Actually, this is probably from Brew. And so you've got his units in here, alpha, beta, gamma. But notice his stuff is mostly Middle Pennsylvanian and upper. The lowest 2 formations in the Grand Canyon are Early Pennsylvanian. And so it's like these 2 basins do not have rocks of the same age. And notice in here, most of the Devonian, they don't even know if there's any Devonian in this formation. But most of the Devonian and the Missourian are not represented in the Grand Canyon. So the Pennsylvanian sections along the Mogollon Rim are completely different than the Pennsylvanian sections in the Grand Canyon based on the ages of the rocks. Okay, so one of the ways that these rocks have been interpreted, Ron Blakey has done really a lot of detailed stratigraphy in here. And he came in and he says, well, we know that these rocks aren't represented in the Grand Canyon, and he thought that the slope-forming rocks at the very bottom, they're just barely in this image, he says, I think that's Hermit Formation. And so if you do that, you're left with the uncomfortable follow-on that these red rocks of the Sedona Cliff are younger than any red rocks in the Grand Canyon, and therefore shouldn't be called Supai because they're above the Hermit, if you buy the Hermit. Wes did not like, the reason that this was called Hermit is the main reason that Wes wrote the other article in the Big Red Book, because Wes had what he thought was really good evidence that that was not true. So when I'm talking about untangling things, is we've got these competing stratigraphies, and we're trying to figure out, using as much data as we can, you know, how you correlate these units and what names you call them. So here's Ron's stuff, and so he coined the term Schnebly Hill Formation for the rocks what he thought was above the Hermit, and then he thought he could see the other Supai units in here, even the early Pennsylvanian ones over here in Sedona. And then here's another one of these. So, you know, starts talking about, you know, here's how these units might correlate, and you're trying to correlate things across here. So I don't want to get in the details. One of the things that Wes Peirce, the lines of evidence that he used, was that if you contour the thickness of the Hermit, and this is his photo, this is from the Big Red Book, Wes Peirce's article in Digest 17. And what you can see is from measured sections, the Hermit is just decreasing in thickness dramatically in there. And so Wes said, therefore, Sedona is all the way down here. You are not going to have any Hermit left by the time you get to Sedona. Now, Ron, I've had a conversation with Ron the past couple of days, And he says, yeah, there's a drill hole here by Flagstaff that he thinks there's Hermit in it. And so he thinks you can push the Hermit, closer to Sedona. Wes would disagree. And if there's Supai, if there's Hermit in Sedona, you have to take this trend in the decrease in the thickness of these units, and you have to reverse it. So this is from Wes's paper, The Big Red Book, and so there's one set of formations that were proposed by Ron Blakey, Don Elston of the USGS and Flag, and Don DePaulo, who taught at Colorado College. They did a geologic mapping area project of the Sedona area for groundwater, and they says, yeah, we think there's Hermit, but we think it's up here, right below the Fort Apache. And Wes says, there's no Hermit in here. I'm not using that name. And also, Ron used Snebly Hill Formation. Wes didn't use it, and Elston and DePaulo didn't use it. So this is what untangling. This is the stuff we're trying to figure out. So let me describe what we're up to. We've been measuring stratigraphic sections in more detail than anybody has measured stratigraphic sections in here. We have some stratigraphic sections we've measured that have 200 units in it. Like that much, that much, that much. And so this is from Sycamore Canyon. This is the red wall here, and this is the basal unit of the Supai. So we've been measuring sections. And when you measure sections, you start discovering things that you might not have expected. So this is a view. We just recently measured the section down the Hermit Trail, the Supai and the Hermit Trail. And this is a view of the Hermit on the opposite wall. And you notice that the Hermit, so here's the top of the Esplanade sandstone here, and then there's the Coconino, sharp contact. You notice the Hermit is nearly all fine-grained stuff. If you go to Sedona, to the rocks that have been called Hermit, it's mostly sandstones. And it's mostly ledges. I mean, there's a lot of slopes and stuff, but there's an awful lot of ledges. And even a lot of the stuff that's between these ledges is still kind of a sandstone. And so from our standpoint, lithologically, there's a big difference between what the Hermit looks like in Grand Canyon versus what it looks like here in Sedona. Wes Peirce and Tom McGarvin is on the cover of Wes's uranium favorability of rocks along the Mogollon Rim, or something. I don't know what it's called, something like that. But Tom McGarvin's holding a Geiger counter on the cover of that picture, so I was glad Tom was here tonight. Wes made a big deal about the conglomerate. Here's actually a fossil in the conglomerate. But there's these carbonate and siltstone class conglomerates and fine-grained sandstone class conglomerates that you can follow along the Mogollon Rim from place to place. Wes made a big deal about it. The Bureau publication he made about it was really about this zone that had uranium favorability, and the conglomerates played a key part of that. We likewise think the conglomerates are really important. Ron thinks these are less important for correlating things, but we think they are. Here's one of these conglomerates. If you've ever been to Sedona, there's a picnic day use area called Grasshopper Point. And this is from the turnoff to Grasshopper Point. And you can see one of these conglomerates, it's just filling a big channel. And so everybody who's studied this, Ron's had students in there, we've studied it, we all think it's fluvial. These are just fluvial rocks. This was from Elston and DePaulo, and they emphasized, they even called these slope-forming rocks in Sedona, which Ron called Hermit. They called it's Supai, it's the conglomerate member. And so you can see those conglomerates there in Sedona. You can see those conglomerates in Fossil Creek. We've measured sections in Fossil Creek and collected samples. There's a really famous locality, which I'm going to show you in Promontory Butte. It's got the same conglomerates in it. And then by the time you get over here to close to the Globe de Cholo Highway, there's another zone in here that's conglomerate. Everybody who's been in here correlates these conglomerate zones from place to place. So we think that's kind of a given. Blakey correlated them, Wes correlated them, Elston and DePaulo correlated, USGS correlated them. And so we think the conglomerates are important, and that zone's important. One of the other things we've been doing, I don't know if you ever, has anybody in the AGS ever shown a picture of a conodont in a talk? Not in a long time. I realized a couple days ago, I was president of this organization 35 years ago. Oh my gosh, old friends indeed. Anyway, so we're getting good conodonts. We've got one of the best conodont guys in the world for rocks of this age working on the project with us. And so every time we go up a section, if there's limestones that we think they're going to have conodonts in them, we collect those and we ship them off. And then conodonts are like teeth. They're made of, apatite. And so they don't dissolve in hydrochloric acid. And so, you dissolve all the limestone and you get these teeth-looking thing. And the creature, the conodont creature evolved pretty rapidly. And so you can actually be very precise with conodonts how the age of these is. So we're doing that. We also spend a lot of time looking for organic material. And so like this is from Fossil Creek, and you can see there's actually a conglomerate around here. I guess it's not in this picture, but one of these conglomerates. And so it's got a lot of plant material in it. And so we've been studying the fossil plants. This is from a paper that I'll show you here in a second, that one of the examples of fossil plants. Copper oxides. See, you had to have a talk with copper oxides in it. And we've also done pollen. We get the specialist, the guy that works on the pollen. And so these rocks haven't had a lot done with them, so they still have pretty good pollen. We also do trackways. This is actually from the Coconino sandstone, so it's a little bit of a cheat. But here's a creature that's going that way up the sand dune, and the way you can tell that is as the creature goes up, he pushes little piles of sand downward, and so here's the pile of sand that came downward. So this creature was going up the sand dune in that direction. So Spencer Lucas is one of the world's best people about looking at tracks. You might not admit that, but it's true. And then the other thing we've been doing, here's Julia. We've been collecting detrital zircons, and we've been working with the George Gerald's lab at the U of A. So we collect the samples, we ship them off to George, and we pay for them. And so we've done detrital zircon studies. We did the first detrital zircon studies of Monument Valley. We did detrital zircons of Sedona. I was in Tucson, so I just handed their lab a sample from Promontory Butte. And we think with that collection of samples, we kind of have enough. We did a big detrital zircon study over by Socorro in a section that has all this great fossil control. So you can say, oh, here's when with detrital zircons, you're basically looking at provenance. Where did this material come from? And the big surprise that happened with the first detrital zircon studies that George Gerals and Bill Dickinson did, they went in the Grand Canyon. And a lot of the material came from the Appalachians. They have zircons that aren't from the Southwest at all. And so we're trying to figure out when do these zircons of different ages show up by sampling rocks of which we know the age precisely from the fossils. So we did that in Socorro, we're doing it here. And so here's the Promontory Butte locality. It was a big excavation done in looking for uranium. There is uranium in this stuff. And there's some copper in it as well, but so we're looking at it, and there's a big conglomerate zone in here, and there's a lot of places you can sample stuff in here. And so here's an example of the stuff from Promontory Butte. I thought this one had copper in it again, but I don't see it. Oh, up here. Yeah. See, I tried to find ones that had copper.
What's the scale on that?
Oh, I don't know. It's this big.
Okay.
That was very precise, just so you know.
That's good.
Yeah. And so, how many had on your bingo card that Steve Reynolds was going to publish in the review of paleobotany and palynology? Can't even say it. And unfortunately, my co-authors, like Spencer, are now calling me a paleobotanist. because I was involved with this. But you see, I'm pretty far down the list. So anyway, so we did a very detailed study of the promontory butte fossils, and a late Missourian age is most likely. So it's late Pennsylvanian, but not latest. And these are in the rocks in the conglomerate zone that again correlates to the, we think, correlates to the conglomerate zone forming the slopes in Sedona. And so we think that those rocks are late Pennsylvanian in age. We also got pollen from Fossil Creek, and it's late Pennsylvanian age in the same interval. And we recollected some more pollen to get better ideas. Well, Julia Johnson and I have been doing geologic mapping of these places because we want, in addition to the stratigraphy, I'm a structural geologist, I'm not a paleobotanist, I know, surprising. We've been doing geologic mapping of these places, so we have them constrained. And you know, when you do geologic mapping, you find stuff that you otherwise wouldn't have found. And so this is a section just north of Jerome, and Julie and I found Naco in here. It's never been really talked about. And so here's the Supai. There's basalt on top, very top of the hill, but this is all Supai. This stuff's all Naco in here. And so we have Naco for the first time in the Jerome area. Now, we measured this section. We got conodont samples. We haven't got the results. But we're assuming this is all going to be Des Moinesian or Missourian or Virgilian in age. We'll see. And here's one of those people who've mapped in the Naco. It's a limestone with orange chert. That is what the Naco looks like. And so we feel pretty comfortable that this is Naco in here. We'll have to, it's provisional until we actually see the data. But one of the things that we discovered when Julie and I went to these places is we measured one section over here, and it had like 8 or 9 limestones in it. And as we went further to the north between Jerome and Sycamore Canyon, we measured another section, and it had 2 limestones in it. And we measured the section at Sycamore, and it doesn't have any Naco in it, except Elston and DePaulo reported Naco in a channel. And so what this tells us is that these units are thickening to the south. You're getting more limestones to the south. That tells us this is coming from the Pedregosa Sea, Pedregosa Basin. It is not coming from the Grand Canyon. These rocks have been given Grand Canyon names in some places. Oh, that's Watahamajee or whatever. But we think this shows you this stuff's coming from the south, and these are Naco. So we'll see. We'll get the ages on them. The other thing that's curious, this unit in Oak Creek, it's been called various things. It's called C, Supai C by most people. Blakey thought it was Esplanade sandstone. When you go in and you look at these rocks, this is from Midgley Bridge, if you know where Midgley Bridge is around Sedona. If you go look at these rocks, you walk up to them, you say they're limestones. I had students, we collected a bunch of conodont samples, detrital zircon samples in Sedona. And we said, oh, we're not going to get anything out of these. And then we looked at them with our hand lens. They're weathering like limestones, but they're sandstones. And so they're a quartz sand with a calcite cement. We think these are a Naco equivalent. Now, Ron would, if he were here, he would tell you, no, that's Esplanade sandstone. So there's these different approaches. But we think this is basically a shoreline facies of the Naco. That's why it's got all the carbonate in it. And if you look at these rocks, they've got like what look like marine trace fossils and concretions and chert replacements and all kinds of stuff that you typically get in the Naco. And so when you walk up to these rocks, you say, oh, that's going to be a limestone. That's a sandstone. It's very problematic. And so this is a paper we published in the South American Journal of Earth Sciences recently. And we tried to look at the different times that the seaways came in and where they came from. And I just wanted you to know where this figure came from. One of the key aspects of things we've concluded is Ron identified a feature named the Sedona Arch. And it's not like a uplift, it's an area that subsided less than the areas around it. And we envision the Sedona Arch as a boundary between two different basins. So it's like a shoulder of the basins. And so one of those basins is the Grand Canyon embayment, and one of those is the Mogollon Shelf, which is related to the Pedregosa Sea. And so we've tried to track these things. That paper talks about the stratigraphy of the Midland Basin. That's another one that was not on your bingo card. But, and so we think, and the Sedona Arch is actually, from our opinion, is west of Sedona. And so when you're in Sedona, we think you're influenced by the Pedregosa Sea, not by the Grand Canyon embayment, by the sea coming out of the Grand Canyon. So we do not think any Grand Canyon names should be used along the Mogollon Rim. So when we write this, we think it's going to be a 200-page monograph published by the Smithsonian. We'll see if that's what happens. Because we have so much data, it's just unbelievable. And so we think that this ought to have names that are not Grand Canyon names, except for the all-encompassing Supai Group. You know, the red rocks below the Coconino and above the red wall, that still should be called Supai Group. There was a U of A guy, Jackson. He was a student of Ed McKee when Ed was at the University of Arizona. And we think Jackson just about got it all right. It was done in the 1950s or something like that. And so McKee had a section, A, B, and C. That's what McKee called him. Notice McKee didn't use Esplanade in here. He didn't use Hermit. He just used A, B, and C because he was not sure how these rocks correlated to rocks in the Grand Canyon. And then in Fossil Creek, you've got these same rocks. The Fort Apache is this key marker you can track from every place. And so Jackson basically thought that the slope-forming rocks in Sedona were a unit that should be called the Oak Creek Formation, because it's exposed around Oak Creek, and that he thought that the Oak Creek was a facies age equivalent of the Naco. We agree with that 100%. When Jackson proposed the term Oak Creek Formation, he didn't measure a type section. He didn't locate where the type locality is, which is, if you're supposed to name units, you're supposed to do all that. We're doing all that. We measured a type section opposite Grasshopper Point of the Oak Creek Formation. And we're going to name it, and we're going to tell you where this type section is, and we're going to publish this very detailed type section of the Oak Creek. And likewise, over by Sycamore Canyon, he named a unit the Packard Ranch Formation. Again, didn't do all the other stuff you're supposed to do to really name it. So we measured a type section of the Packard, and we're going to name it. And then these other units, we think Amos Wash is a perfectly fine name. We think Corduroy is a fine name. Blakey over in Sycamore Canyon named a member the Sycamore Pass member, and it's a really sandy member that kind of comes in here. It's this stuff up here, above the Fort Apache. We think that's a really good name for that unit, and Blakey had already measured a type section. We measured another section. I'm not sure he measured a type section, but he measured a section. We measured a type section of it. So this is from Brew, and what he's showing is here's the ages. You know, again, he thinks if there's any early Pennsylvanian, it's the alpha member. It's the residual from the red wall weathering, and then you have limestones that go away, and then limestones and shale, and they go away, and eventually you have kind of mostly clastics over here. And he thinks there's a lateral facies change between the Supai and the Naco. I like that more than Spencer likes it, but I think it's right. And so the problem you have, and look at this stuff. How do you differentiate these two? When people tried to map these two or define them, like somebody said, because you have interbedded limestones and red clastics. Limestones look like Naco, red clastics that look like Supai. And so somebody said, we're going to define it at the highest limestone. That puts way up the hill. Or we're going to define it at the lowest red clastics down here. Everybody's got a different way to define that contact. We think if you have to resort to those things, you do not want those two things to be in different groups. So we think, this is tentative, we think that the Naco Formation name for the Mogollon Rim goes away, and that we call it something else. And, you know, we don't know what the name will be, but it will be a local name from where this stuff's well exposed. We have some pretty good ideas of where it is. So we think that the name Naco, although it's been used on the rim ever since Ross, I think, brought it in there, we don't think it belongs. Here's the other problem. The Naco on the rim is Upper Pennsylvanian and Middle Pennsylvanian. The Naco in its type locality down in southern Arizona goes all the way from the early Pennsylvanian all the way to the top of the Permian. And so you have this mismatch between the ages of the units. And so we don't think the name Naco Formation probably should be retained, but that's being discussed. And this is the promontory butte cut. This illustrates the problem. Here's kind of Naco looking stuff in here, and the rest of this is Supai. And it goes back and forth. It's a really, I mean, I'm a mapper, and it's a really hard contact to map. Wes Peirce said the Arizona Bureau of Mines, they found a big limestone ledge that they could follow, and that was the boundary. So anyway, we think that Wes got this just about right. You know, if we were him, we would have brought the Oak Creek Formation over here like he did. We would have brought the term Packard Ranch over here. And so a little bit change there. Wes Peirce unfortunately put the Fort Apache as a member of the Corduroy Formation. It's one of the units. We think it's its own unit. I'm a mapper. I can map Fort Apache until something. And so, but the point is, Wes pretty much got it all right from our perspective. I wanted to point out that the roadside geology book is at the printer, and Eric, you said it was announced in GSA today. So anyway, thank you very much. That's it. I'm glad to take any questions.
If you do have a question, please use the microphone. And there's one right behind you, Karen. I'll leave this.
Yeah, take it away from Stan.
Is this on? Can you hear it?
Yeah,
Hear me?
speak loudly though, it's soft.
Okay. On the karst that you saw along the Mogollon Rim that goes into the red wall limestone, does it correlate with the karst in the Grand Canyon and goes into the red wall that's named the Surprise Canyon Formation? I know Eddie McKee told me once that some of those karst formations in the red wall and the Grand Canyon were 500 feet deep. They were huge.
I think the karst event correlates. When you go to a place like Desert View and you walk out in the easternmost viewpoint in the Grand Canyon, you look down at your feet, you're standing on a karst breccia. And so that karst surface is in there, and you know, there's lots of caves in the red wall, and you know, I mean, you're the world's expert on breccia pipes and your breccia pipe uranium. And so there's that kind of stuff all through the system.
Yeah, some of the caves you can go into in the Grand Canyon, you can see the karst on the ceiling where it's collapsed down into the red wall, but below that you're in the red wall itself in the cave. But
yeah,
not
that's
in
right.
The karst, and it's kind of really neat to be able to see that third dimension.
Yeah, we think that those surfaces correlate, but you've read the article McKee and Gottschalk. You know, they looked at the age of the red wall from place to place, and you're missing the entire upper red wall along the Mogollon Rim. And so it's an equivalent karst event, but the duration was probably longer in the Mogollon Rim. It clearly lasted into the Pennsylvanian before you started burying stuff over the top of it. That was a good question. Thank you very much.
Steve, there are about 29 people following this remotely. You can ask them if they have any questions. They can unmute and ask.
Okay, let's do the in-person questions first. Here's one here. Yeah, Ron thought he might be able to join this, so I don't know if he did.
This question of the
Hold it
karst,
close. That's a quiet microphone. It's on, but just hold it close.
The question of the karst, you don't use the molasse down in, I mean, most of Utah Colorado, New Mexico, you have molas. You don't see that here?
Oh, let's explain the problem. In Colorado, there's the basal unit of the Pennsylvanian is a unit they call the Molas Formation, probably named after Molas Pass, I assume. Actually, and the molas is exposed right there at the campground at Molas Pass. I use the term molas all the time in the field informally, because that red rock, those bedded red rocks I showed you between Strawberry and Payson, that is like the molas. It's very similar. It's in the same kind of stratigraphic interval. It's above the Mississippian red wall. Here, it's above the Mississippian red wall. At Molas, it's above the Mississippian Leadville limestone, which is an equivalent of the red wall. And so, absolutely, that stuff is a Molas equivalent. People have mentioned it, like Brew mentions, this looks similar to the molas, or it's in the same position as the molas. And, so yeah, we don't use that name here because this unit, the bedded stuff in the alpha member of the Naco is really discontinuous. I mean, I've tried to map that stuff, and you get like the section I showed you, you get, 10 meters of it, and you go 50 feet in any direction, and it's gone. It's like filling channels and stuff. So we prefer not to use that name here. Also, we're kind of gun shy about bringing units in from far away, like Don Bars, who actually taught my brother geology at Fort Lewis College. Don Bars thought you should use the term Deshay sandstone along the Mogollon Rim. And Steve Rousey, the Arizona Survey, did a lot of work trying to see if you could track it. They may be equivalent in age. They're similar rocks in some ways, like the Sycamore Pass member. Looks a lot, it's kind of Aeolian. It looks a lot like the Deshay sandstone. But they're probably just separate patches of sand. And you can't seem to get them through the Holbrook Basin. You can't seem to get it around the edge of the Holbrook Basin. So we don't want to use those kind of distal names along the Mogollon Rim.
I guess my follow-up question is, have you used...
Hold it close, thank you.
Have you used any of the subsurface data, like other, even Wes Peirce used the subsurface data?
We have not used it as much as we want to, but that is one of my homework assignments from Spencer Lucas, is to get into the subsurface data. And, as Ron has pointed out, that subsurface data is important. Wes was really good with the subsurface data. I mean, Wes spent a lot of time. The Arizona Survey, I don't know if they still have it. We used to have well cuttings. Do you guys still have those?
They still have them.
Oh, they still have them. Okay, yeah. So that's an important source. On the other hand, we can track stuff along the Mogollon Rim with a lot of places that are covered. There's just no cover and there's no exposure. But we think with carefully measured sections. I mean, Julia Johnson and I went and we did reconnaissance after reconnaissance to try to find places where you could measure good stratigraphic sections. And then we tried to do little geologic maps of those places. Some future Arizona Survey contributed report, but yeah. So, we have not done a lot yet. We know Wes spent a lot of time. I trust Wes's interpretation of the subsurface a lot, and Steve Rousey basically went through the data as well, and Steve basically said Wes got it all right. Steve Rousey made the same conclusions that Wes did. So, okay, thank you for that question. Others? Okay, so we can invite those people who are online to unmute their microphone and just make comments or ask questions. Oh, Chad, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'll have a quick one. For the detrital zircon data, were you able to also get maximum depositional ages? And if so, how does that compare with the biostratigraphy?
Yeah, I would say when I had the discussion with Mark Petcha today, he said, "Do you want MDAs?" And I said, "No," because you're getting Appalachian zircons, and they're having to be transported across the sea. There's no concurrent volcanism, at least nothing that's obvious in the Pennsylvanian and early Permian. You know, later in the Permian, you have a chance of getting that stuff. So we're just using the detrital zircons to get at provenance. And we already have some kind of some early conclusions about some of the stuff. I didn't present any of the detrital zircon data, take forever. But it looks to us like the zircons from the Appalachians, the young ones, the 300 and 400 and 500 million year old zircons, they're arriving in different basins at different times. And the Sedona Arch, we think, might be a barrier for transport of those things from one basin to another. We'll see. That's preliminary stuff. Okay, that looks like the last in-person question. Anybody online? Just unmute yourself and talk to us. Okay. Is somebody talking to us? We'll see. Ferris, yeah. I'm not even sure authors get 50% off. But you'll notice that this has a GSA moniker and Mountain Press. GSA recently, after our book was fully submitted to Mountain Press, GSA bought the Roadside Geology series from Mountain Press. And so we like it because ours is the first roadside geology book that has both of those logos on it, and GSA is going to advertise it in addition to Mountain Press advertising.
And as a GSA member, you'll get a GSA.
Oh, could you try again?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. It seemed like Blakey's diagram is cross-sectioned from southeast Arizona up to the north in the Red Book. He expresses the fact that there's a lot of transition, a lot of packets of units from the marine in the southeast up to the Sedona Arch. He brings that in, and the stuff that I think he was calling Hermit along Oak Creek Canyon and down into Sedona, it's quite a bit more crumbly. It's kind of punky. It's not really like Supai. And then, so if the Hermit that he identified is Hermit, then what is the unit then above the Hermit that goes up to the Coconino? Is it not the Schnebly Hill, or did you dispose of the Schnebly Hill designation?
That's a very good question. We do not think that the slope-forming rocks in Sedona are Hermit, because wherever we have dated those rocks, they're late Pennsylvanian in age. Now, maybe they're late early Permian, which is what the Hermit is in Sedona, but the next exposure to the east in Fossil Creek, that they're late Pennsylvanian in age, where we have new pollen data from. So we do not think that it's appropriate to use the term Hermit. If you don't use the term Hermit, then the rationale for using the term Schnebly Hill goes away, because it just means it's Supai. So, but on the other hand, but Ron's observation that there's rocks in the Grand Canyon, the rocks in Sedona that are not represented in the Grand Canyon, that's right on. So, it's a question of do you use this? We think some of that terminology, like Sycamore Pass, should be retained, but we actually think that people like Jackson and actually, Jackson was a McKee student. And so Jackson proposed the term Oak Creek Formation as a McKee student. So presumably Ed McKee thought that was okay. And so, Ed McKee's student in Sedona did not use the term Hermit. So, I don't know. Ron, if he's online, he'll disagree with all this. But,
Oh, I'm here.
Oh,
I'm
good.
here, and I disagree.
Okay, so Ron, why don't you present the alternative view? This is science, and that's what we want to hear.
Well, it would be too long. I think you and I have to get together and talk about this. But the Hermit conglomerates are full of the Walshia fauna, which is a well-documented early Permian plant fauna. the Esplanade sandstone can be traced from Sedona to, what's that point there at?
Chino
at
Point.
Slickman?
Chino
Chino
Point.
Point. It can be traced almost continuously. The reason it's full of carbonates is because the winds were coming from the northwest. They were blowing off the tidal flats to the west and picking up carbonate grains, and it's a carbonate aeolian sandstone. When you look at the grains in detail, you can see that many of the grains that are missing that are carbonate cement are actually echinoderm fragments. At first, I thought the Esplanade was marine because of that, but it turns out that they have the same thing in the Cedar Mesa sandstone in southern Utah, and they have those, the windblown echinoderms. You can tell an echinoderm very easily because it's a single, each part of an echinoderm is a single crystal of calcite. And so when they crystallize, it's a single distinct crystal, and you can see these crystals throughout the Esplanade. You can see them throughout the Cedar Mesa, which is the equivalent of the Esplanade, and so forth. But, you know, I think the details, you and I have to sit down and chat about this rather than shout back and forth about who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, you know, I actually agree with that. And Ron and he and I have had conversations in the last couple days. So this is not a surprise to him what I said tonight. And it is, you know, like I told him, I said, I'd rather present this stuff as an AGS abstract and an AGS talk and get feedback before it goes into print. You know, we just want to try to get it right. But at this point, you know, we you know, Ron has made incredible contributions to the stratigraphy of these rocks. He's measured probably as many sections as we did. We've measured about 30 stratigraphic sections in great detail. And so, you know, it's trying to reconcile these different points of view. And, you know, do you say, I'm going to let the fossil data from Fossil Creek and Promontory Butte be the most important thing, which is what we're doing, or do you use some of these other things that Ron just expressed as that's the most important thing? And it just depends what your priorities and your preferences are.
Yeah, I completely agree that the Promontory and Fossil Creek biotas are Pennsylvanian, but there are a lot of red beds above that in Fossil Creek, and that's what I think is perhaps equivalent to the Hermit. What happens is the Esplanade and the Hermit begin to lose their character as you cross the Sedona Arch, and they're very difficult to pick out in Fossil Creek, I'll admit that. But there are red beds well above those conglomerates that you're talking about that contain the late Pennsylvanian fossils. So I don't think there's a problem with the Hermit being Permian in the Sedona area. It's an unusual, I'll agree, it's an unusual lithophases. Much of the Hermit in the Sedona area, as well as many places, is actually a lustite. It's windblown silt. So it's actually a siltstone. Those of you who know sedimentary rocks know that a pure siltstone is a very rare rock type. There's only a couple of ways that it can form in certain kinds of lakes and by windblown processes, because the wind blows, of course, silt primarily. And so Lynn Sorgan at the University of Oklahoma has looked at what I call the Hermit in Oak Creek Canyon, and she's convinced that much of that unit is a lustite. It's fluvial, of course, but it's got a lot of loess on the plains between the channels.
Okay, yeah, thanks. We have another question here.
I would just add that the subsurface data seems to conform with what Ron says about the Esplanade, extending at least as far east as Flagstaff or the Roy Owens well east of Flagstaff, but not down into the area you've concentrated on.
Yeah, I think everybody acknowledges that at some point the Esplanade goes away as you go to the southeast. Yeah. And the question is, you know, where is the actual position of the Sedona Arch? You know, again, Ron was the guy who
if you go back
figured
to
it out.
Ron's articles, I think he will say that that's hypothetical arch. That,
right.
That there is
right.
there is a I mean, things like the Fort Apache do thin out in that direction, and there is something, maybe the Coconino High, or,
Yeah.
but as far as an arch, like
It's not like an uplift. It's just it's an area that's subsiding less. Yeah. To us.
Exactly.
Yeah. To us, the fact that the Fort Apache makes it almost all the way to Sycamore tells you that the Sedona Arch is further west. So we put it west of Sycamore, and so if you're in Sedona, you're already on the southeast side of the Sedona Arch. We don't think you're on the Sedona Arch in Sedona. Now, Ron probably knows more about this, but
No, it's if there is a Sedona Arch or something separate from the Coconino High, I don't know where it is, but there is this low structural element.
Units are thinning towards that thing from the Grand Canyon and from the Pedregosa Basin. So there's something there, and the question is, what is its orientation and where do you put it?
And it extends all the way up almost to Utah.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. No, I think Ron's identification of the Sedona Arch was a really important contribution. Okay, Karen in the back. Be a gentleman, haul that back to her. Thanks, Chad. See, you raise students right, and they do good things.
Everybody always likes to hear about ore deposits, and I know you tried to show your perfunctory copper there in the Promontory Butte, but I wanted to add something to it. That samples that I took when I was at Promontory Butte and Fossil Creek, the uranium content is actually up at about 0.3%. They've got a significant amount of uranium in them, and just something to think about is that kind of makes me think that there is a connection between these channels, and perhaps you could even use uranium content to try to connect some of your other channels as you go from one section to another.
Right, and so the observation is that this zone that has the conglomerates in it and the plant fossils has uranium, and that big publication that Tom McGarvin's on the front of, Wes Peirce did that. You know, that's a really important publication Wes did.
Yeah, Wes gave me a lot of information years ago on where to go to find a lot of uranium.
Oh yeah. So we agree, and Wes's Bureau of Mines bulletin is the definitive source for that. And Wes used that interval and the copper and the iron along and the uranium along it to define that and to follow it. So yeah, Tom said he kind of drove the vehicle, and Wes would say, "Go up and put the Geiger counter on that outcrop for me, Tom." So I can see that happening actually. Okay, let's end it there. But thanks everybody for being here.